Hello, it's Miss Moorfield, and tonight we're going to continue talking about percentages, but tonight we're going to talk about tipping and we're going to talk about interest. So again, these are concepts that are going to come up all the time in your life. They should be familiar to you, which should make them easier to understand because they're things that you see your parents do all the time or you have heard about in classes or at the bank or in family conversations and whatnot. So we're looking at a receipt and it's for a restaurant. So you'll see Rosalita's at the top and the 4 different things that were purchased. So the tacos for $9.99, your fajita quesadilla for $12.99, the queso and chips was $4.50, and 2 drinks for $7.98. So these words should be familiar. You should see your subtotal is $35.46. The tax has been figured out for $2.48, giving us a total of $37.94. However, before you leave that restaurant, you need to think about tip. Waiters and waitresses depend on their tips for their income, so it's important that you know how to figure it out. So you need to think to yourself, how much should I tip? Now, some people will say 10%, some people will say 20%. I typically gauge about 15 to 20% just because I know that it's such an important part of their income. So we're going to use 15 to 20% for the purposes of our video. So if I look at a waiter and I think, okay, they were good but not fantastic, maybe I'll give them 15%. So how do I figure that out? Now for this, we are looking at our total. We're not looking at our subtotal. We're not looking before tax. We're looking at what is 15% of my total. So 15% of $37.94. Well, I'm going to find out my 10% first, so I'm going to move my decimal over, and I know 10% is $3.79 or $3.80. Half of that is my 5%, so I know half of 3 is $1.50. Half of 80 is 40, so $1.90 plus $3.79, so it's going to end up giving me $5.69 when I calculate it. Notice I used my mental math. I found my 10% with my decimal point. I halved it to find my 5. I added it together. This should all be sounding familiar. Now, personally, when I tip, I round up just because, again, they're depending on it, and also it's easier for me to add on my bill. So if I found out 15% was $5.69, I would probably round it up and tip 6. You could also tip $5.50, or to be exact, you could tip $5.69. But that's why you'll notice on my receipt I've tipped $6. So let's look at another example. If my bill is $32.50 and I want to tip 20%, so this waiter or waitress was really good, what am I going to do? Well, I need to figure out what 20% of $32.50 is. So you'll see this should be a decimal point here. My 0.20 times $32.50. Again, I'm going to think 10%. I'm going to use my mental math strategies. I'm going to work smarter, and I'm going to think if I divide it by 10, I'm moving my decimal over. So 10% is $3.25. So I'm going to take that times 2 to figure out my 20%. So you're going to do my math, and I'm going to find out pretty easily that that's $6.50. So 20% is a $6.50 tip. So then for my total bill, I am responsible for adding my tip to my total. So I would need $32.50 plus $6.50, which is going to give me, if I add my 50 cents together, that gives me 33 plus 6. So now my total bill becomes 39. So again, your tip is going to depend on the percentage you choose, but the process should be familiar. You're finding that percentage of your total and then adding it on. The percentage that you find is the tip itself. Once you add it, you know your total bill, what you're actually going to be charged for when you leave the restaurant. So we're also going to talk about interest. So I'm looking at the problem in your textbook on page 84. The first thing before we get into it, we need to know what is interest. So interest is money earned on your savings or investments. So this is a term you will hear with banks all the time. If I put money into my savings account and I don't touch it, I leave it there, the bank rewards me by giving me interest. That's my reward for saving or investing. So it's a certain percentage of what I've put in that's added on. Now, because it's based on the amount of money in the account, that'll change year after year. So if I have $3,000 for 5 years that I'm investing, and I have a 12% interest each year, I need to look at the sum of each year. So the first year I put in, I have $3,000. So to figure out my interest, it's pretty simple. I'm going to take 12% of 3,000, so you'll see 3,000 times 0.12, and I'm going to add it to my initial value. I'm going to add it to 3,000. But once I get past that first year, I'm not adding it to 3,000 anymore. I'm adding it to whatever the year before's answer was. So if I solve 3,000 times 0.12, or 12% of 3,000, I'm going to figure out that that answer is, that answer is $360. So after the first year, I have $3,360. So then when I look at my interest for year two, I'm no longer taking 12% of 3,000. I'm taking 12% of 3,360 and then adding it to 3,360. So then you'll see how that'll change in year three, and year four, and year five. So whenever you're solving for interest, even if you're solving for the third year, you have to solve year one and year two to move on because it's always taken from that year's total, so it increases over time with your previous interest included. So something really important to pay attention to when you're solving interest is that you've laid out every single one of those years since they build off of each other. And again, this example came right out of your textbook on page 84 if you want to look at it for more information. So tonight for your homework, I want you to think about investing that interest. So if you invested $2,500 and you had 15% interest, how much money will you have at the end of the year? So I'm only asking you to look at 1 year's of interest. So 15% interest on $2,500. Notice I want to know the total at the end of the year, not the number of interest. So be careful when you're solving that you're answering the question I'm asking. Post that on Edmodo and any questions you have, and I'll see you in the morning.